Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here. While we've been on the whole topic of partial reps and things like that, I think it's really important that now that some of this is starting to come back into vogue again, that we discuss the history of this and the failures of people who have promoted doing large amounts of heavy partial reps in order to build size or strength, because there is a long history of this. It is not something new. It's not something trendy. It is something that comes back into vogue for about a year or two every single decade, going back for years and years and years. This isn't anything new, and it has been found to be a colossal failure over and over and over. So let me put on my +5 hat of weaponsmithing, work on skilling up my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this, because there have been a few people who've successfully done this, who've used partials not necessarily as their main training, but as a secondary exercise, who were world level lifters in the past. That has kind of made it easy for certain people to market these things, because that gets brought up. They take guys like John Grimmick, who was very well known for having a tree set up in his backyard. If you guys remember this story, some of you may or may not know it. Had a tree set up in his backyard, into where he would take a weight that he couldn't overhead press, and he would put it in chains and overhead press it a few inches, and over time would lower that chain, and he would leave that weight up there, whatever weight it was more than he could overhead press, and every few weeks he would lower the chains about an inch, so that he would reduce an inch and add an inch to his range of motion as it got down to the harder part, and he would eventually be able to lift the weight. But people need to understand, this is also someone who used this as an accessory exercise. He used it as an accessory exercise, and there were people who did stuff like this. There's another big lifter who did the same thing with really insanely heavy squats, and had dug a big hole in his backyard, and he would be limited on the squats because the bars would hit the hole that he had dug, right? And he would climb in that hole, and he would add a little bit of dirt over time, and then stand it and squat, and eventually he got in there to where he would be limited by just gradually doing it. But people need to understand that when people use these methods, these were not their primary form of training. This was a secondary method they used to increase the range of motion, with the goal of eventually doing that full range of motion. And they would slowly add fractions of an inch to their range of motion with a heavy weight for a partial. But people need to also understand, many of these people's lifts have later been beaten by people who never did partials at all. These were guys just who were trying to innovate back in the 50s and things like that, who were trying to innovate and come up with new ways to be the best in the world. And these tools to some extent help them, and people need to understand heavy partials done in certain manners as secondary exercises, as accessory movements, have been used throughout history for people to make successful gains who are already very advanced lifters. Some of the best of the best, and even guys like Jamie Lewis use some of them to some extent, but they're not their primary form of training. These are an accessory movement, and usually these people are still doing very heavy versions of the full range of motion exercise they're doing this as a supplement for, and have built an enormous strength base on those normal exercises. So it works a little different than people think. Now, it's been marketed several times through history. Particularly advocates of HIIT have tended to advocate this minimalist training, like that minimal volume. And the biggest run that I remember after I started lifting was this guy named Peter Sisko wrote a book called Power Factor Training, and it sold enormous numbers of copies. And they rope you in talking about we need to have a formula where we can determine workload that you do. And work in a muscle is essentially how much weight you moved and how many times you did it, right? And that's what determines how much stimulation a muscle is getting. It was basically looking at tonnage. Someone breaking it down as a mathematical formula, using formulas to determine this. But then they pointed out that muscles only care about how much work they did, right? That to move 300 pounds or 600 pounds 10 times requires a certain amount of work, and that stimulates muscles. And then they take leverage out, and here's where they get you, because they'll rope you into this concept. They'll point out and get you on that idea of looking at the power factors and the numbers only. And then they come in and say, but you know what? Moving 600 pounds, 10 inches, it doesn't matter how you move that 10 inches. The same amount of work had to be done, right? So therefore, the same amount of muscle stimulation happened. So if you could move 600 pounds only 2 inches, it would stimulate the same amount of growth if you were to do that 5 times as if you had moved it a full 10 inches. So really, at the grand scheme of things, it doesn't matter, that you don't have to do a full range of motion. The muscle's still being worked. And what they found is that people obviously got the highest power factors when they did only partials in the strongest range of an exercise and would do like 30 or 40 rep sets with sometimes double a person's 1 rep max on the full range of motion. And they devised a whole training system around this. And tons of people ran it. You know what? I went out and bought the book and I ran this program. I ran this program for over a month. And just like everyone else who ran the program, guess what happened? We all saw our power factors go up massively. Man, I mean, I was repping out 600-pound bench presses for 20 and 30 rep sets. Do the strong range of motion, moving the weight 2 inches. Doing lockout work with it. You know what? I did all this stuff that was in their program, and it was hilarious because, I mean, a lot of people were doing it, and I knew other people who were running the program. I had several friends who went and bought the book. People were all running this same program. And at the time, I was only about a 350-pound raw bencher, and I was doing this 600-pound lockouts, and I was doing all my exercises just the way they advocated. You know what happened? I went to get back under a bench press. After being a 350-pound bencher, I put 325 on the bar, and it stuck to my chest, and I couldn't lift it. I lost over like 30 pounds off of my max from 1 month of doing their training program. From 1 month of doing it. And I was young and naive. But it looked really good. It looked really scientific, and it looked revolutionary. It was this whole new concept supported by their own scientific ideas and all these mathematical formulas. Well, guess what? It didn't work. And tons of people ran this. Tons of people, tens of thousands of people bought this book and ran this system, and they all lost strength. Everyone I knew who ran it made horrible progress on it, and before long, no one was buying the book anymore. It was considered to be garbage in all training circles. All right, and even coaches were warning people. I met coaches and things who were warning people, hey, don't buy that book. It's garbage. Don't follow that system. It's not based on reality. It's not going to work. But people bought it because it was flashy and new. Same thing happens when you start messing with West Side Barbell Conjugate System. I was messing around with single ply lifting, and so I ran the conjugate method for a couple of months. I did it while on YouTube because I was going to mess with single ply lifting. Some of my good friends I power lifted with talked me into trying single ply. I bought a bench shirt, I bought a squat suit, you know, all this single ply stuff. And started training this stuff with them, and we were all running the West Side Barbell System, the conjugate method, which is brilliant for equipped lifters. But you know what I found? All my lifts went down on it. I got weaker on all of my raw lifts by doing their system, which consisted of very little full range of motion pause work. Very, very little. It was tons of box squatting with chains, with bands, lockout work, board presses, benching with bands, benching with reverse bands, all this stuff. You know what? I ran it for a couple months. I actually felt like I gained some muscle on it. But guess what happened? My squat and my bench press went down. My 1 rep maxes went down, my 3 rep maxes went down, my 5 rep maxes went down. I got weaker on my actual raw lifts by running it. Because that's the reality of partial training. Partial training doesn't allow you to get stronger on full range of motion exercises. Now, I'm not talking about cutting an inch or two out. I'm talking about where you are doing half reps or less so that you can add more weight. It doesn't actually make you stronger through the full range of motion. It doesn't carry over. And anyone who's trained this stuff long enough or messed with these things knows that it has very little carryover. And that if you've already built a bit of a strength base and you go over to exclusively this sort of training for a little while, your lifts will get weaker when you return to full range of motion. You will not be as strong. You will lose strength because you haven't trained the hardest part of the exercise. And because you've gotten weaker at those joint angles, you will lose strength. You won't be able to perform as well. And that's the reality. And here's what it comes down to, and people need to understand when it comes to partial training. A lot of people are like, well, you know, it overloads the muscles more. No, it doesn't. Because the muscles are doing less work, that's why you can move more weight. Most partials, you're doing the strongest range of motion that has the leverages to where the muscles have a leverage advantage, just like a jack. And you can't forget that. Your muscles do not have to work as hard to lift the same amount of weight because your bone angles have changed, your insertion angles have changed. You are working the range of motion to where you're strongest because your bones and other things are putting you at a leverage advantage, again, like a jack does when you're lifting a car. Just like it's not that hard for you to lift a car with a jack, but there's no way you'd lift the back of it with your bare hands. It's 100 times easier. It's 100 times easier sometimes. All right, and that's the reason sometimes in a strong range of motion on an exercise, you can actually lift double the weight, because you're not only moving the weight a much, much shorter distance, that requires less energy, but you are also doing the easiest part of the exercise where the muscle has the most leverage advantage and simply doesn't have to work as hard. Now, we could argue, rightfully so, that work is work. And if you were to train a muscle pretty much to failure, or 1 rep from failure, through the strong range of motion, that it would still stimulate upper threshold fibers. It would still grow. The muscle will still grow from that. No one's arguing that it won't, because at the end of the day, if you do enough work with a muscle, it's still going to recruit tons of muscle fibers. It's still going to get to the upper threshold fibers. If enough work is done to hit those, then it's going to fatigue a lot of muscle fibers. Absolutely. You know what? Static contraction work, weighted stretches can technically, in theory, do the same thing. They can stimulate muscles. No one's arguing that they can't, because they can, but partials simply do not have the same potential for muscle fiber recruitment that full range of motion does. And it's not because they don't recruit muscle fibers. It's purely because full range of motion is more likely to allow you to recruit more different muscle fibers through a muscle than doing a partial rep is. Even with similar amounts of workload and fatigue. You could probably get pretty close. There's a lot of muscles with partials. You could probably reach 90 or 95% of their growth potential using partials, or even isometrics or static holds. It can be done, but they are never going to have the full potential that you could get if you were to reach the same level of fatigue using full range of motion on any muscle group. So the reality is, you can simply build more muscle and more strength with a muscle by doing full range of motion you can with partials. It may not be a lot more. It may not be a lot more on the muscle, but it is going to have more potential. It's going to have the potential to be a little bit more with a full range of motion. So partials don't ever have a muscle building advantage the way people think that they do. And at the end of the day, I would tell people who are saying, well, I was struggling to make gains doing these full range of motion exercises in that muscle. Well, no, you just weren't doing enough work. That's the only explanation, because there is no more growth potential from the partials than there is with the full range of motion. It doesn't work that way. You just simply weren't training the muscle hard enough. And I would say to someone, go back to your full range of motion and then train with the same mindset and train them as hard as you were doing with the partials and the same focus that you were doing, and see if you don't keep growing. You probably will. In fact, you might even see better results. And sometimes the only reason people will see those improvements is because they've changed their mindset. But I promise you, on the strength end, you are absolutely going to suffer for it. And the reality is, a lot of heavy partials simply have a higher risk of injury potential than doing their full range of motion counterparts. There are only a couple of exercises out there that are dangerous to do full range of motion. Weighted dips is one of those, but the majority of lifts are actually safer if you perform them correctly with a full range of motion. You're going to be better off in terms of risk. And I do understand that that does vary from lift to lift. Some lifts are far safer to do than others with partials. But at the end of the day, there are a lot of exercises, probably the majority, to where you are simply at a higher risk of injury by doing heavy partials. And you're doing so with no payoff, because you're going to, number one, gain a lot less strength than with full range of motion when you actually have to lift something. You're going to gain less overall strength due to less joint angle specificity and not training the weakest part of the exercise. And number two, you are doing so with an increased amount of risk to you potentially. So at the end of the day, while it might seem trendy and popular, people need to remember this stuff isn't new. It's been done for decades. It comes in and out of vogue, and ultimately, most partial training, unless it's done for very specific reasons, is generally going to be slightly inferior for hypertrophy for you, and it's going to be vastly inferior for strength gains for you. Alright guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.